Now, what we're going to do is read out a text by Dorothy Allison called Puritans, Perverts, and Feminists. Dorothy Allison is a lesbian writer from the US. She's still alive. And the text dates back to 1985. All right. I'm going to tell the most embarrassing fact about my sex life. A secret I've kept for years, a tacky secret, a humiliating secret, an altogether unexplainable and deeply closeted detail about my adolescence. No, I'm not going to tell about rubber undies or trained puppy dogs, or even a lesbian's long-suppressed oral fixation on phallic objects. The honest-to-go truth is that I spent most of my adolescence, and I'll admit it, even my 20s, jacking off to science fiction books. Marvelous, impossible stories full of struggle and angst. As a girl, I read Robert Heinlein's Podcane of Mars, C.J. Moore's Gyral of Joy, the Telsey books by James Schmidt, More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon, and all of the Alex stories by Joanna Russ. Each and every one of them stayed with me longer after I put the book down. Their worlds were the worlds where I went to get away from the one in which I had been born. And those worlds were lush, adventuresome, scary, and deliciously satisfying. I'd buckle Gyral's sword across my hip, and I wipe the demon's kiss from my lips, mourning the lover I had been forced to murder, but borne up by my pride and outrage. I would turn my cat-calm eyes on the huge, dangerous creatures that captured me and wanted to use me like the aliens were always doing to Telsey. And like her, I would outplot the bad guys and walk triumphantly in the end. Later, there were the Joan Vinge books, C.J. Cherry, Vonda McIntyre, Susie McKee Charnas, and Elizabeth A. Lynn. I became the child thief captured and flogged in McIntyre's novel. The riding woman, cleaning my knife while listening to the runaway slave who had walked to the end of the world. One of those fascinating perverts Elizabeth Lynn seemed to understand so well. I would orgasm to the adventures I conjured up for myself in those worlds, but more important was the constant, excited satisfaction of imagining myself so far away and different. Justice happened in those books. Justice, revenge, vindication, female bonding, sex, and what seemed to me a more humane, compassionate philosophy of life. I'm as much a creature of those books as I am of my family, my region, my sexual desire. I am the wages of pulp. It is frustrating to me that so many people divide the erotic and the everyday into such stubbornly segregated categories. There's this notion that sex is separable from life, that pornography is not only debased and physically suspect, but easily recognizable. When women become fervently righteous about the subject, I want to ask them about their girlhood fantasies. Maybe they have redlined their erotic imaginations since growing up, but what made them breathe hard when they were girls? Did they never come home from some silly movie and lay across their beds, seeing themselves as the heroine triumphant, or the heroine in danger, or even the villain, the one who traps the hero or the heroine and gets all the really good lines of dialogue anyway? I wonder if anybody else saw the movie Barbarella and fantasized not Jane Fonda's blank-face helplessness or the angel's muscle torso, but the Black Queen with her spinning knives and ominous eye patch. It's easy to get people indignant about nasty, sexist paperbacks most of the population doesn't want to admit they read anyway. It's a lot harder to get people to think about, and harder still to talk about, the kind of erotic imagination that takes banal movies and hackneyed best-selling romances and the most cliched television programs and construct personally tailored sexual fantasies that are invariably more effective than mass-market stroke books, no matter how explicit. It's unnerving to talk about how our sexual imaginations really function, even if our sexual desires are nowhere near those black leather and chrome scenarios our social magistrates would love to outlaw. For feminists, it often seems dangerous to acknowledge the sexual imagination at all. The sexual is unpredictable, irrational, sneaky, and far-reaching. Worse still, it is completely resistant to simple legalisms or clear philosophical categories. Most sexual imagery does not have one interpretation, but a range of multi-level impacts depending on context, personal taste, or hidden symbolism. I remember all too well one of my best friends as a teenager, a girl who appeared to have no sexual affect of any kind, who prayed the rosary 3 times a day and planned with stubborn, methodical determination her eventual admission to a convent in the Southwest. As a Baptist child, I found her Catholicism exotic, fascinating, and quaintly perverse, especially the way she talked about with seemingly unconscious sexual detail. The way she described praying all night, the pain in her knees and the burning ache in her bent neck, the breathless image of the crucified Lord almost stopping her heart with anguish, reminded me of nothing so much as my own late-night immersions into erotic dreams and purifying orgasmic release. None of my oblique sexual hints were picked up on by my friend. I don't think she ever touched her genitals except to hurriedly cover them with cotton underpants. But maybe that was her way of refusing sexual shame, putting all those feelings into the safe, sanitizing hands of the Virgin Mary. All things considered, she was probably safer with her than with me. I didn't comprehend how devious and subterranean the sexual imagination could become until I read the Joanna Russ's essay, Pornography by Women for Women with Love. Russ's essay explores an idea most everyone else had been ignoring as intently as they could. She examines a genre of Star Trek fiction, particularly the women's KS for Kirk and Spock, fantasies and anthologies. Those often X-ray rated by the authors themselves books and stories are surprising for their homosexual content, although like a good bit of the astonishingly violent Japanese comics, they are written mostly by heterosexual women for other heterosexual women. Many of the KSs are about Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock becoming lovers, and they often include a great deal of SM content. Russ goes into wonderful detail about the erotic component of fantasies, pointing out that their context often denies the actual acts that take place. For example, the stories are full of scenes in which Kirk or Spock is beaten or tortured. One of the characters winds up caring for the victim with pronounced erotic or romantic feelings. In a few cases, sex proves necessary to save the victim, jarring them back to sanity or kickstarting their immune system. The Kirk-Spock characters might be shocked or embarrassed by their behavior, but unable not to perform those startling acts. The conflict itself became part of the erotic charge, and that was something I understood about my own sexuality. The repulsion, attraction dynamic that can overwhelm and obscure sexual desire. The characters in Kirk-Spock stories get to do things they can never admit they want to do, allowing the authors of the stories the same luxury. The best thing about Russ's essay is that she looks closely at the stories for what really is going on. That is, in what uses the authors themselves are putting their fantasies. They see the KS material as a portrait of love and sex as women might want those acts to look in real life, regardless of whether they take place with 2 men or a man and a woman. She cites the works of theorists Susan Goober, Patricia Lamb, or Diane Veith, and examines the coding and transference that is characteristic of most the fantasies. She suggests that when women science fiction writers write about aliens, they may actually often be writing about women. An example can be seen in the KS sex practices. The boys have anal sex with the ease and lubrication that is actually characteristic of vaginal intercourse. I'm an old Star Trek fan myself, and I loved the whole genre. But I couldn't help wonder why there weren't fanzines that gave us Uhura's adventures with a few Romulan female warriors. Was lesbianism so dangerous it couldn't even be handled symbolically? Maybe Kirk and Spock were somehow both encoded females, a variation on alien dykes. After reading Ross's essay, I began to reconsider what my life as a teenage science fiction fan had really been about. I found myself thinking of the levels of meaning I took from science fiction, not just the straightforward adventures, but the symbolic and political lessons I abstracted. After all, I ate up science fiction books like candy, until I was living more in the world of fantasy than in the small southern town where I was born. Yes, the women and girls in those books had adventures. They had great passions, terrors, successes, and narrow escapes. Their minds were constantly working, and almost never in the ways traditional fiction told me women thought. They weren't worrying what the men and boys thought of them. They were worrying about survival. They weren't hassling over whether or not they had to wear makeup. They were fastening on their cloaks and taking off across the stars. I also had lots of books in which one character was getting tortured or injured in order to have the offer to offer erotic comfort. And most of those had been my favorites because I figured out that I might want to find some interesting exotic creature who would tie me up and drive me out of my mind with lust, when most of the female population was running around in beehive hairdos, sweating over whether it was okay for a girl to call a boy. Those books were pretty damn radical stuff. These women read like dykes to me. They even had sex, real sex, without symbolic shrouding. One of my old favorites was, in fact, Anna Russ's novel Picnic on Paradise. Not only was the heroine Alex a caustic, sharp-eyed Phoenician thief who spent most of the book making fun of the rich white jock who in any other book would have been the hero, she kept on going into the bushes with the teenage punk and fucking him. And I do mean the active word. Alex climbed on top of that boy and enjoyed herself. She didn't even care if he kept his Walkman on while she did it. That was a scene that put my lust-ridden teenage soul into a tizzy, prodding my imagination in directions that probably wouldn't have greatly surprised Russ's publisher. This wasn't about coding or veiled references. It was flatly heterosexual, but still seemed to offer tacit encouragement to female sexual desire and female sexual aggression. I thought it applied to lesbians as much as anybody. Alex, after all, never struck me as overly concerned with heterosexual passion. She was into adolescents, girls mostly, but there was that boy in Picnic. Each and every one of the books I've mentioned became fodder for my teenage fantasy life, most of which was definitely sex-obsessed. The private stories I made up for my own enjoyment tended towards creation of slightly scary and definitely inhuman erotic machinery. Androids who would not do only what their programming commanded, or machines into which one could fit one's naked and tender flesh without fear of any intrusion by the human. The conditioned fearfulness of a terrorized and dependent girlhood led me away from imagining any actual human sexual contact with other fearful or possibly dangerous human like myself. I was conditioned to suspend my disbelief with science fiction, and that meant I could imagine myself in the books. But it was still a big jump from my tentative and careful fantasies to imagining the sexual adventures of those marvelous heroines. That I began to do it all as I credit to the power of the really gifted science fiction writers who gave me worlds in which little girls did not have to confront the horrors of my everyday life. Some authors were better for stimulating my imagination than others, and surprisingly, to me at least, the best were not always female. Samuel Delany, for example, gave me the female heroine of Babel 17, a poet, warrior, and revolutionary who achieved her most powerful goals through the use of particularly powerful alien language. More importantly, he gave me the short story Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones. The latter was so significantly and emotionally devastating that I read it once and promptly lost the book. An act it took me a long time to realize was in no way accidental. For many years, I kept telling people fragments of the story in the hopes that they would know where I could find it again. But I invariably left out the most personally dangerous details. Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones was the first story I read that actually had recognizable, almost contemporary gay characters. It was also my first explicitly SM story, beautifully written and subtle enough for me to virtually pretend it wasn't implying the kind of relationship it did. The story made me think about my own romantic imagery. The boy, the singer, whose body is covered with scars, who cannot be stopped from pursuing his own masochistic destruction as actively as he goes out to sing his poems and insists it is this unjust world that must be changed. No Coda's homosexual character study, no Salmineo portrait in miniature. Delaney's masochistic revolutionary took hold of my heart and showed me on my own face, just as queer, just as masochistic, just as driven, and just as stubbornly hopeful. When I finally admitted to myself why I so loved that story, how I saw myself in it, more than my erotic imagination shifted. My everyday human-to-human relationships were altered by it as well. I began to think that perhaps it might be worth the risk to touch another human being to allow them to touch me. Delaney's works were also revelations to me about what the life of an artist might be. Both of the young male masochists in Helix and the female heroine of Babel 17 were posed with a clear concept of who they were as marginal and political artists. When I picked up Dahlgren, I found that he had taken that concept and pushed it to the limits of what seemed possible, providing along the way a completely original approach to the traditional messianic myth so popular with science fiction writers, many of whom are startlingly conservative and militaristic. Delaney's poets were anarchists, unwilling to spend their talents striving to control history, other people, or sexual behavior itself. He championed the queer and disenfranchised, created women who were as unpredictable as they were fearless, and men who came close to breaking my heart with their vulnerability and stubborn grappling with their own desires. He suggested with every sketch, moreover, the profoundly complicated interactions that mark all sexual exchanges. Delaney's ability to treat queer sexuality is still unsurpassed. For my adolescents, it was a revelation. I've talked to many women, both heterosexual and lesbian, about their adolescent attraction to science fiction. I've tried to draw them out about the ways in which it affected their concepts of the sexual. It is amazing to me how many women have told me that science fiction is where they put their sexual imaginations. One of my lovers, for example, who never saw any of the softcore lesbian pulps before her coming out, swears instead by her sexually aggressive and sexually matter-of-fact women she found in science fiction. They gave me the idea, she told me, reminiscing about her own adolescent fantasy life. For her, as for me, the hidden message was clear. It didn't have to be what everybody said it was. It could be different. You might be able to have sex with plants, or intelligent waterfalls, or friendly machines, or women, and not have it be a social or moral catastrophe. Once out, that's a secret that could change everything, and has. End of quote.
Dorothy Allison. Le nom du texte est
So this is called Puritans, Perverts and Feminists, and the text by Dorothy Allison was published in a set of essays with Cambarakis Publishing House, a feminist publishing house.